Hey, what's up guys? Gains and Girds here. Should you low bar back squat? Should you high bar back squat? Should you be back squatting at all? We're gonna discuss that and so much more in this video on back squatting. We're gonna dive into the literature. We're gonna discuss what biomechanists have been studying, the different muscle activation that you get utilizing either a high bar or a low bar back squat, and what it means for you and your training. A lot of people are having this conversation out there, but very few are doing it in a way to where it's actually applicable to your training. So let's jump into some actual demonstrations of these two different movements and discuss the differences that we've seen in the literature and how you can apply it to your training. Hope you enjoy it. Let's go. Well, let's transition to some videos of me squatting by some dumpsters. So here's a high bar back squat. Okay, I'm doing a high bar back squat. The bar is clearly high on my back, on top of my traps. It's a more vertical oriented squat pattern. And I transition to a low bar here. I roll the bar down on my back, and you can see it's clearly a different squatting pattern. They look completely different, the high bar versus the low bar. And that's why there's a discussion about muscular activation differences between these two positions. So that red line represents the force of gravity acting through that external load in the barbell. Okay, that's the high bar position. This is the low bar position. And what we're really paying attention to is the moment arm, or the length of distance between the axis of the hip joint and the force of gravity acting through the barbell, shown here in this video. So the knees are also, there's a moment arm happening at the knees. We're not going to talk about that yet, but here you can see that's my low bar. My hips are further away from that red line. Now in the bottom position, more importantly, my hips, that blue line are that blue line's clearly longer than it is shown in this next slide of the bottom of my high bar back squat position. So there's more hip flexion occurring in my low bar back squat than there is in my high bar back squat. Research has shown that. But what does research say about the differences in muscular activation between these two squatting patterns? Let's take a look. One of the first studies done in 1996 by Rettenberg and colleagues found minimal to no difference in quad activation between the high bar and low bar back squat. Yes, it was a small study, but they did actually find higher peak forces occurring at the knees during a high bar back squat, and they did find higher quad activation in a low bar. So that was contrary to what you would expect. However, in 2017, Glassbrook and colleagues showed greater quad activation in the high bar back squat and greater posterior chain involvement in the low bar back squat, which is exactly what we would expect to see due to the biomechanical differences between these two squatting patterns. So here's a close-up of a low bar. You can clearly see there's a lot more butt back approach here. There's clearly more hip flexion occurring and less knee flexion occurring. So more posterior chain involvement of the hip extensors would make sense. Now with my high bar back squat shown here, you can see that my knees nearly lead that movement on the descent, right? So there's more knee flexion occurring, and therefore there could possibly be greater quad activation occurring with this squat pattern as well. Now, before we come to a conclusion on muscular activation between squatting patterns, we have to look at a recent study done by Murrah and colleagues done in 2020. So they actually found no difference or minimal difference between quad activation between these two squatting patterns, but they did find that with the low bar back squat, all muscles were greater loaded in the eccentric portion, right? So there's more eccentric loading of all muscles in the low bar back squat. But more importantly, with that low bar back squat, they did find greater activation of the biceps femoris and the glute max, or two hip extensor muscles. So they did confirm that there is more posterior chain involvement with your low bar back squat, right? There's that moment arm in the low bar back squat in the bottom position shown again. You can see that there's a lot of hip flexion occurring, therefore greater involvement of the hip extensors. Now, with my high bar back squat, you could argue that there's greater quad involvement, although research is inconclusive. It would make sense because there's more knee flexion occurring. But let's talk about what this means for your training. So now the question is, do I high bar back squat or do I low bar back squat? The answer is you do them both. But the problem is some people can't high bar back squat. They don't have the ankle flexibility or mobility in order to get into that high bar position, because your knees do have to travel over your toes adequately enough in order for you to get into that vertical chest position. So what do? Well, you can use squat shoes, which we're about to talk about next. But the reason I want you guys to do both, okay, is with a high bar, if you get greater quad activation, which, like I said, one study has shown that, a few others have as well, but others have shown the exact opposite. Even if you could get greater quad activation, you'd want to do it. Now with the low bar back squat, Murrah and colleagues in 2020 showed that you get more eccentric load on all muscles through a low bar back squat compared to a high bar. So you definitely want a low bar back squat too. You also want to overload the posterior chain. You would also want to train them both just from a functional perspective. You use both of those squatting patterns in your everyday life, So being strong in both those positions leads to injury prevention and longer and higher quality of life. So let's talk about squat shoes and how you can high bar back squat if you don't have good ankles like me. So I'm sure you've seen these before, squat shoes. All they do is elevate your heel, and by elevating your heel, you're gonna be able to get more comfortably into this high bar back squat position that we talk about, okay? So here's a video of me doing high bar back squats with my squat shoes on. You can see that it looks a lot more comfortable than the previous videos I showed you. We're gonna compare those in a second, but like I said, if you lack ankle mobility, you should be elevating your heels when you try to high bar back squat, because if not, your heel's going to be popping up off the ground. You can see in the picture on the left, my heel's coming off the ground. I'm also requiring my ankles to flex a lot in order to get in that position, whereas the picture on the right, I'm able to get into it a lot more comfortably. Now let's look at these two movements without squat shoes and with squat shoes. Here's a close-up of my high bar back squat. You can see that I'm almost hitting like a break right here. Like, my knees are struggling to get further over my toes because I lack ankle mobility. But whenever I throw my squat shoes on, I'm able to get into a higher chest position and it looks a lot more fluid, right? You can see my heels not popping up off the ground as much, and it looks a lot more comfortable. If I freeze it right there, you can see my chest is in a higher position and my knees are even further over my toes than they were before in this high bar back squat position, which could potentially lead to greater quad activation, right? We had that discussion earlier. So what does the research say? Well, there was a kinematic analysis done in 2017 by Legg and colleagues, and they did show what I just told you guys, that you're going to be able to get into a more vertical oriented squat position with your high bar back squats if you wear weightlifting shoes or elevate your heel. You're also going to be able to do this without requiring a lot of ankle flexion. So guys, if you lack ankle mobility, elevate your heels to do your high bar back squats. Use them for your low bar back squats too if you want. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and share it with somebody who's struggling with their squats. Thank you so much for watching.